I've come off being a vegetarian. I like meat replacement things, but my reservation about them is that they can be very, very processed.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to eat less processed food.
Yeah.
You know. And also, you know the other thing? A pork pie with the
Yeah.
jelly and all that.
Yeah.
You know, it's food of the gods.
It's good. Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing very, very well. In today's video, I wanted to talk about the actor Martin Freeman. And not because of his credentials as an actor. I mean, you may well know him from films like The Hobbit trilogy and the UK version, the original version of the Office sitcom. But the reason I wanted to talk about Martin Freeman today is not because of his performances in films, but because of his performance in real life, I suppose. I want to talk about who he is and something that he recently said in a podcast. Now, the podcast, I think, is sponsored or hosted by Waitrose, which is a large supermarket here in the UK. And so it revolves around food. The people on the show, they eat a meal, they talk a little bit about food. It's used to promote this supermarket here in the UK. And so the conversation of food naturally came up in this podcast. And what Martin Freeman was eating on this podcast was a spaghetti bolognese. And when he was consuming the spaghetti bolognese, he spoke about how actually he has just recently gone back to eating land animals. Now, I say land animals very purposefully because a lot of the framing around this conversation has been around Martin Freeman giving up on his vegetarianism or no longer being a vegetarian, but he stopped being vegetarian decades ago. In fact, Martin said that he started eating fish again in his late 20s. He's now, I think, about 52, early 50s. So we're talking decades ago. But nonetheless, he has gone back to eating land animals. So in effect, he's given up on his pescatarianism. I mean, some of the things that are said in this podcast are, I mean, just baffling. We'll watch some of the clips together and talk it through. But my goodness, some of the things said in this podcast will just blow your mind. They are so hypocritical, disingenuous, nonsensical, absurd, illogical, whatever word you want to use. It is all of those things and more. So let's get into it. But let me just start by saying before we do that one of the things that will be severely lacking in the rest of this video in terms of what Martin says and the media reporting, the things that will be severely lacking are common sense and critical thinking, something that we all could do with a little bit more of. And actually, speaking of logic and common sense and critical thinking, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor. Now, today's sponsor is Brilliant. For those of you who have never heard of Brilliant before, well, Brilliant is a fun, engaging, and interactive learning platform where there are thousands of lessons about a wide variety of different subjects related to things like science, technology, mathematics, critical thinking, and so much more. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving to enhance the learning process, and the lessons themselves have been created by award-winning researchers and academics from places such as MIT and Caltech. Brilliant's lessons are suitable for all skill levels, from beginner to more complex and advanced, and they also help you develop your critical thinking as well as knowledge, meaning that by doing their lessons and courses, you are gaining multiple transferable skills at the same time. So if you want to learn about things such as AI or programming or coding or statistical analysis or literally so much more, well, you can get started on Brilliant for free for 30 days by clicking the link in my description or by going to brilliant.org/EarthlingEd, where you can also get 20% off a premium annual subscription as well. So now let's get back to talking about Martin Freeman, but a huge thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video.
Before we sat down, Martin, you were telling me you've not had a bolognese. You've had a bit of a bolognese hiatus.
Why?
Because I've been, I've come off being a vegetarian. I started being a vegetarian in like January 1986.
Wow.
So,
For ethical reasons or health? Or
yeah, because I was never really, I was never comfortable with the idea of eating animals.
Okay.
So I've not had a really good bolognese since then. It's really new, going back to being an omnivore.
Yeah.
Just sort of eating what I like. It's a funny one because I like meat replacement things. But my reservation about them is that they can be very, very processed.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to eat less processed food.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, so the first thing for us to just establish very, very briefly is Martin's comment about never having a proper bolognese is a criticism of his cooking and not a criticism of meat-free or plant-based food. It is so easy to make a delicious plant-based bolognese. It is one of the absolute easiest meals that you can veganize are plant-based bolognese. So that's the first thing to establish. The second thing is that Martin says that it was just never, eating animals was something that never sat right with him. He was never comfortable with it. But he's been eating fish for decades. He admits this later on in the podcast. I'll play that clip later. But he says about how in his late 20s, he went and ate fish and chips. He has been eating animals for decades. He is perfectly comfortable with eating animals. I guess he just doesn't view marine animals as being animals, which I suppose says it all, doesn't it? He obviously has never connected with the ethics of... I was going to say the ethics of vegetarianism, but I suppose that's a little bit of a contradiction in itself. I suppose he's never, connected with the ethics of not eating animals from an ethical perspective. Obviously, if you connect with the ethics as a vegetarian, well, you have to become vegan because, being a vegetarian for ethical reasons, you should really at some point hit that brick wall of going, hang on a minute, dairy and eggs are just as unethical and involve slaughterhouses just in the same way because all egg-laying hens and all dairy cows are killed in slaughterhouses. So an ethical vegetarian is someone who is still living with a significant amount of cognitive dissonance because to be ethical in our food choices means to be vegan. So those are the first two things that we have to talk about. But obviously, there is something else in this clip that we need to discuss. The reason why he's gone back to eating land animals, as he says, is because he's worried that plant-based alternatives can be too processed, and he's trying to eat less processed food. Okay, first things first. He's eating a spaghetti bolognese that contains pancetta.
Diced beef and pork. A little bit of pancetta in there as well.
Now, as you will well know, pancetta is a processed meat. Not only is it a processed meat, it is a class 1 carcinogen. So Martin Freeman is trying to eat less processed food, which is why he's gone back to eating land animals. He says, as he's eating processed meat, a class 1 carcinogen. Not only that, but the spaghetti bolognese also contains beef, so cow flesh, and red meat is a class 2 carcinogen. So he is eating 2 different types of carcinogens in this meal while talking about the fact that he has gone back to eating these types of meals because he is worried about processed food and wants to eat less processed food. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it. Also, it's worth noting that on that dinner table are a few other things which are processed. The first being garlic bread. Ultra processed. The other being the pasta itself. Now, maybe it's a whole wheat pasta. I don't think it is. I think it's white pasta, which again is another processed food. I mean, Martin is eating lots of different types of processed food while complaining about the fact that he's worried about eating too much processed food, which is why he's gone back to eating the food that he's currently consuming. It just does not make any sense. But there's also something else on the dinner table which it's just awful, which is Parmesan cheese. Now, people may think Parmesan cheese, that's vegetarian. And also some people think that Parmesan cheese isn't processed. But actually, Parmesan cheese contains something called rennet. Now, rennet is an enzyme that is taken from the stomach of young ruminants, normally calves. So these animals are killed, they're slaughtered, and the rennet is taken from their stomachs and then used in different things, but most importantly to this conversation, different types of cheese, one of those being Parmesan. Now, you can get vegetarian Parmesan, but Waitrose do use calf rennet. So not only is the Parmesan cheese not vegetarian, which, makes it especially unethical because you have the exploitation of the mother cows for the milk, the forced impregnations, the removal of the babies from their mothers to make the milk that's used in Parmesan cheese, but you also have this enzyme taken from a slaughtered calf as well. I mean, it's just so unethical and so disturbing and abhorrent. So Parmesan cheese is, I would like to say quite comfortably, a processed food, but not only that, it is a disturbingly unethical food as well. So what Martin is eating is a meal filled with different types of processed food, many of which are also deeply unethical because of what they do to animals, and his justification for eating those foods is that he wants to eat less processed food and he is concerned about the processed nature of certain plant-based alternatives. Give me a break. But sadly, we're only getting started. There is plenty more still to come.
The thing that I had to break my veganism for was at a party I saw a scotch egg. I was like, ooh. Yeah. But at the time, I really remember thinking, well, I'll just have an egg and be veggie. And I ate about 4 of them and I was like, oh, they're wrapped in sausage meat. That's why they're nice.
That's why
they're
Scotch
lovely.
egg was one of the things I thought,
really? Yeah.
I'm allowed, because again, it's a free country. I can do what I like.
Yeah, you
I'm
can
gonna-
have
I'm gonna
Scotch egg,
Scotch egg.
Martin.
And also, do you know the other thing? A pork pie with
Yeah.
the jelly and all that.
Yeah.
A bit of mustard on a pork pie.
Oh, I
Pie.
love that.
man.
Yeah.
Well, I literally got off the train last night, was walking up to the hotel and bought myself 2 pork pies. Sat
Fabulous.
on the bed like Alan Partridge at like 11 o'clock at night eating cold pork pie.
Yeah.
Literally rubbing my stomach going,
It's food of the gods.
yeah,
It's good.
awful.
All right, before we talk about the pork pies, because let's face it, we absolutely have to talk about the pork pies here. I also just want to address something else that Martin says very, very quickly. He says it's a free country. And it's just this incredibly defensive remark that really kind of comes out of nowhere. He's using it to defend the consumption of Scotch eggs, which are a deeply unethical food. But he has to just kind of like say that, doesn't he? It's a free country. It's almost like he's, I would say, grappling with his own dissonance, but I actually think he's more concerned about the criticism he might receive. Well, Martin, the reason you would receive criticism and the reason you're receiving it from me is because laws don't equal morality. And just because it's a free country, and in the context of this, just because you can legally eat Scotch eggs doesn't mean that ethically and morally that's the right thing to do. And I think it is disingenuous and actually cowardly to hide behind that way of thinking, because it's kind of saying, well, if it's allowed here, therefore I can do it. But that's completely lacking any critical thinking, because of course things can be culturally normal and legally allowed and be deeply unethical, as is the case with the consumption of animal products. So I find it quite interesting, his defensiveness, how he just has to go in. It's a free country, isn't it? Weird, right? Super weird. But I also think it speaks to maybe his fear of the criticism he might receive. Anyway, let's talk about the pork pies, or as Martin calls them, the food of gods. Now, of course, when you look at what a pork pie is, processed meat, so a dead animal, wrapped in jelly, which will be made from gelatin, also from animals, and then wrapped in pastry, which probably contains animal products as well. So I don't think that pork pie should be considered food of gods. They should be considered food of the devil, because they are so cruel and so unethical and involve so many different things that come from exploited and slaughtered animals. And it is a deeply disturbing food to consume. Now, more, I suppose, interesting to the conversation we were just having, which is about processed foods, there's also something very interesting to note about pork pies as well, which is how ultra processed they are. I mean, pork pies are arguably one of the most processed foods that you could possibly think of. I mean, just think about it. Processed meat, again, a class 1 carcinogen, something that will increase the likelihood of you developing cancer. Processed meat, wrapped in processed jelly, wrapped in ultra processed pastry. It is processed on processed on processed. I'm struggling to think of a food that is arguably more processed, because it contains 3 different things which are all processed. I mean, my goodness. Again, the hypocrisy. I've gone back to eating land animals because I'm worried about the processed nature of some plant-based alternatives. But you know what I'm really excited for? Eating Scotch eggs and pork pies. Again, the media reporting around this. How is it possible that these articles that are discussing this, why hasn't there been more critical evaluation? Why hasn't there been, Martin Freeman said this, and it's actually quite ironic because he said this while eating processed food and while talking about how excited he is to now be able to eat Scotch eggs and pork pies. The narrative around plant-based alternatives is what's important to these media outlets. It's not about the logical consistency of Martin Freeman. Oh, they don't care about that. What they care about is using what Martin said as another part of their arsenal, as another weapon or another tool for them to use in this ever-developing narrative, which is that plant-based alternatives are too processed and are unhealthy, and therefore it is healthier to eat animal products than it is to be vegan because of these processed plant-based alternatives, which you don't even need to eat.
I know that I just wanted more balance in my diet. That's kind of why I did it. It wasn't, you know what? It wasn't even a craving. You speak to so many people, because I've been vegetarian most of my life, and then I was pescatarian actually. So I went from pesky to what I am now. But for a long time I was veggie for years and years and years. And people would say, yeah, but don't you just miss a bacon sandwich? And I never did. I genuinely never did until one day I was rehearsing a play in Birmingham. I was veggie. I was in my late 20s, and I found my feet taking me to a chippy. It was weird, man. You know, and before I knew it, I was ordering a piece of cod.
Yeah.
I was like, what am I doing? I was taking it and going, this is wrong. But then having it and sort of, because I always knew I liked the taste of meat and fish. It wasn't about that.
Yeah.
But it was just about where your line is.
Yeah,
you know?
sure.
And so my line shifted, you know.
The thing is, Martin, when we use arguments such as it depends where your line is, it creates this version of ethics and morality that is entirely individual. The only thing that matters is where you draw your line. So theoretically, someone could draw their line in such a way as to then create the moral justification that harming Martin Freeman isn't a bad thing. You know, their line says that harming Martin Freeman is morally justified, but that doesn't mean that it is morally justified. It doesn't mean that it should be viewed as ethical just because this person has decided that their line allows them to. This is the problem with this way of thinking. You know, I'll just draw my line somewhere. You know, where's my line? Firstly, where that line is drawn will be entirely based on things like biases, cultural norms, hypocrisies, cognitive dissonance. It's not drawn based on consistency or logic or critical thinking. Because again, if we're drawing lines, well, where are you drawing that line? Why have you decided that those animals should die and other animals shouldn't? Imagine if we decided that something was okay because someone said, that's where my line is. Everything and anything can become morally permissible then. There is no such thing as something being immoral or wrong or therefore should be illegal or stopped, because as long as someone says, that's where my line is, this line of thinking allows that to happen. This way of thinking about things allows them to become morally permissible. Clearly, that is a way of thinking that is very, very dangerous and will lead us to having to accept many, many things that we obviously know are completely immoral. So look, it's a completely absurd argument to use. It is fraught with problems. And also, again, it's just not based on anything that is close to being substantial or substantiated or involving genuine critical reflection that allows us to create consistency in our values and ethics. It is so inconsistent. And I just find it so frustrating when people say this, because it's easy to say this when it's not your life on the line. It's easy to say this when it's not you who has been exploited, or you who is suffering, or you who has been taken to a slaughterhouse. It's easy to say this when you are the oppressor, when you are the one with the power to be tyrannical. It is easy to say this when you are in the position of authority. But if you were the victim, if it was your life on the line or your body that was being exploited, you wouldn't think this was justifiable. You wouldn't say, oh, well, as long as the oppressor who is exploiting me says that's where their line is, I guess I'll just have to accept it as being moral. No, of course not. This is a way of thinking that only suits the oppressor. But let's get into the final clip, because if you were under the impression that we must have reached the peak in this video, that surely we couldn't go any further when it comes to the absurdity of what has been said, well, think again, because after all of this conversation, the other guest, Tony Schumacher, has something to say which will just leave you wanting to pull your hair out.
Tony, we've been stalking your social media.
Yeah.
We've noticed that pastime of yours is you quite like videos of cats and dogs that have made you cry.
Yeah.
Are you quite a man in touch with your emotions? Are you quite an emotional man?
Oh my God!
You cry at a cat video.
I literally will cry at a cat video. I'll cry. Duncan, my son, has got a book about Spot loses his mummy.
Oh, poor Spot.
Don't start, because I'll go and there's 4 pages, right? I can't get past page 2 when I'm starting to cry.
Oh, wow.
Honestly, it just kills me every time. The kids looking at me like, what's wrong with you? You know, and I sob my heart out constantly. Wow. Honestly, just sob my heart out.
I did warn you that that clip was going to just leave you just in a state of astonishment. It goes from them talking about how pork pies are the food of gods, and how bacon sandwiches are amazing, and how Scotch eggs are incredible, and how, you know, it doesn't matter. It's just where your line is. You know, we can do whatever we want to animals. It's just all about where your line is. We go from that to then Tony Schumacher, literally the person who says that he can be missing a bacon sandwich as he's eating a bacon sandwich.
I can literally be missing a bacon sandwich while I'm eating a bacon sandwich.
It goes from that to them then talking about how he's just such an emotional person who cries at videos of animals. As I was watching through this podcast, I was going through different states of emotion, as you can probably imagine. And then when this part of it started, when it cut to them talking about Tony's emotional side and him crying over animals, I just wanted to throw my hands up in the air and just say, how is this the world that we exist in, where in a video, in a relatively short interview, there can be so many things that don't make sense, and it kind of culminates in this bit towards the end of them talking about animals and how Tony cries over animals. And it gets even worse because Spot the dog is a children's book character. They're not a real dog. They're a make-believe dog. They're a fictional character. Spot the dog. I used to read Spot books when I was a child. And he's talking about this Spot book where he gets separated from his mummy. And that makes Tony cry, the thought of Spot being away from his mum. You are eating cheese, Tony. You are eating dairy products. These products are not, based on fictional characters. This is real life for animals. Babies are actually being taken away from their mothers to create a product that you are then grating on the flesh of slaughtered animals. And you're crying over a fictional character being taken away from their mother in a children's book. You are crying over cat and dog videos whilst gorging over the flesh of animals and talking about how you're eating animals and you're missing eating animals as you're eating animals. Look, what do you say? What can you say about that? Look, I have to be fair. I have to bring this back. I have to become level-headed. I have to take some of the emotion out of it and go, look, it's not Tony's fault. He seems like a nice man. I'm glad that he has emotional reactions to videos of animals. And it does speak to something very positive and caring about this man, that he does have, emotional reactions to a children's book. That's a really good thing. I don't view that as being negative in terms of the actual reaction he's having, in the context of what they're talking about. I just find it so frustrating that we can go from him laughing about eating dead animals to then him talking about crying about fictional animals. I know that it's not Tony's fault. It's not Tony's fault. It's the culture, it's society, it's, these beliefs that have been taught to us that mean that we do view dogs and cats differently to other animals. I'm not blaming him and viewing him as this terrible person because of the absurdity of what is happening in this video. I do think it is overall positive that he is a compassionate, kind person who does have these reactions. I think you could probably veganize Tony maybe quite easily if he is this person that's been presented in this moment. But I just can't believe that. It can go from one thing to the other thing and them not realize the contradiction. How it can go from them talking about pork pies and bacon sandwiches and scotch eggs and going back to eating animals or land animals. It can go from that to this conversation about dogs and cats and how sensitive Tony is when it comes to animals. I guess Tony in many ways represents the average person, doesn't he? We all like videos of dogs and cats. They're lovely, they're sweet, they make us laugh, and they can make us cry. Obviously, issues around animal suffering do make us cry, and that's a good thing because it shows that we care. So I'm not devastated that Tony's having that reaction. I'm just devastated that the absurdity of that isn't real, isn't obvious, isn't clear. Isn't being revealed to everyone. And there's just 4 people on the dinner table who, as soon as they have that conversation, it should click. But it just speaks to how ingrained this speciesism is. It speaks to how normalized our mentalities around animals are. It speaks to how deep-rooted this problem is. That something so obvious and something that should be so revealing is not. There will be people listening to this podcast. There are people commenting on this video, and it won't be revealed to them. It's not being shown to them, even though it's there in front of them, so obvious. You are being a hypocrite. It's screaming out to them. And yet, of course, it's not being viewed in that way because of how deep this problem is and how deep this view of certain species of animals is within us because of cultures and laws and such. So that brings me to the end of the discussion over the video. there's a lot in there, but isn't there? There's so many things that are said that you just go, really? As always, I'd love to know what you think about what it is that I've had to say. So let me know down below in the comments what your thoughts have been about this conversation and your reactions to the clips that I've shown. I very much look forward to reading your comments. But a huge thank you to Brilliant as well for sponsoring today's video. And as always, I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.